Let's move on to Iraq. This is the war that never ends. Now we have the battle for Mosul, a stronghold of ISIL. We're hearing that Iraqi and US forces have made pretty significant gains to retake the city. But we're not hearing about what happens afterwards. What happens when this city is liberated?
Well, you've hit on the key question, Anand, because everyone always knew that retaking Mosul was going to be the, let's put it this way, relatively easy part, right? Because, you know, when you have U.S. air power, you have a pretty strong Kurdish Peshmerga forces, reconstituted Iraqi army, and once the Shiite militias get into the game, you know, ISIS is not going to be able to withstand that kind of offensive. But, you know, what they're going to do is meld back, you know, they're going to try to find the next ungoverned space, and they're going to try to reconstitute. And it doesn't take much for ISIS because they can just wreak havoc through terrorist attacks. But I think that the fact that Mosul will be retaken will be of symbolic importance. And what Iraq needs to do and what needs to happen in Syria is ungoverned spaces are never good because ISIS will find their way to these ungoverned spaces. And so, but the day after is going to be the key. And this is, you know, only chapter 1.
Right, Raza, what do you think? I mean, will we see the militants that belong to ISIL, will they just completely melt into the population, wait for this to be over, and then re-emerge in another spot, which, as Afshin tells us, could be a space which is ungoverned?
Absolutely, I agree with that line of reasoning, because that is the whole growth of ISIL and its affiliates has been largely due to the ungoverned spaces that are found now in Iraq and Syria. And, you know, the whole idea of state building after the US invasion of Iraq has completely fallen flat, and that is the urgent priority that needs to be taken care of. Now they have Libya, another place where they have been regrouping. The Al-Qaeda has also shifted there. They have Yemen, which is under great stress and conflict. So there are many spaces. I think what really is important to understand is that these patchy, you know, military interventions can only have a very limited impact. The real issue here is to get a kind of consensus between the major powers like Russia and the US and others as to prevent the regrouping and further strengthening of groups like ISIS. And that requires state building, and that is an urgent priority that international community must not abandon after, you know, exiting Iraq.
Wang Guan, when we talk about state building, is that an acknowledgement in some way that there's no military solution to this? I mean, you can bomb ISIL as long as you want to, but they're not going to go away. That ultimately you are going to need some kind of political way out of this.
Right, I think peacemaking was always easier compared to peace building because it involves the institutions of the country. When, like Afshin said, when you topple a leadership and when you subvert a regime, it might be easy, but what's going to be after? You know, what should be followed? What should be followed? That is really the hard part. So I think that it takes lots of efforts to engage the stakeholders. For, you know, to involve Russia, to involve China, to first of all to build the legitimacy for the involvement itself, because let's not forget when the U.S. intervened in Iraq back in 2003, it was the coalition of the willing, or so it was called. So first of all to have legitimacy, and then to engage really a broad coalition of partners across the ideological spectrum globally. And then really to put development and building of institutions such as public sanitary stations, you know, courts, right, and also schools, those kind of institutions ready first.
Magnus, ISIL has shown itself to be a very brutal group, but it's also a very resilient group. And I'm wondering what would happen if it is defeated on the battlefield, let's say in Iraq or in Syria. Will they then take their battle to the streets of Europe and the streets of the United States?
Like you said yourself, I think it's very difficult to say what will happen. And the war on terror is always going on, and the battlefields are not only in Syria and Iraq. And I think it's you know, hardcore politics that can win the war, and it will be difficult to say what the European nations will do after this battle, because, like you say, it's a very big moment in the war, and I think the nations will have to have a very good cooperation, and hopefully after the elections here in the US, we will have a president that can lead a process where a very good foreign cooperation will be as a strongest weapon in this war.
Okay, let's look at another story that's been making news these past few weeks, and that is Philippines. President Rodrigo Duterte turned things on its head. He's been to China. He's paid a visit to China, and he says he wants to disentangle his country's very strong, very long links with the United States. Is this, Wang Guan, a major diplomatic victory for China?
Well, I think that was quite unexpected in the first place, that the Philippines had a new president right after a relatively unfavorable ruling against China by The Hague with regard to South China Sea. And then we have this Filipino president who went very vocal about voicing his concerns against the established military alignment between U.S. and the Philippines, which was also to the thrill and excitement of the Chinese leadership. And then later, Chinese diplomatic community certainly seized on this opportunity and engaged President Duterte and invited him to China. And then there we saw the visit, which was quite successful. And from what I heard from back home, most Chinese are, they fell into two camps. For one, they're really excited about this new prospect of turning a new chapter in China-Filipino relationship. But on the other hand, some people are quite, cautious about it. When President Duterte said there's going to be a separation between U.S. and Philippines, Beijing really wanted him to clarify what this separation means. Does it mean that you will kick the tens of thousands of U.S. troops out, stop receiving hundreds of millions of military aid from the U.S., or does it just mean that you will have a more friendly relationship with China, and then there will be status quo when it comes to U.S.-Filipino military alliance? So I think that we would like to have more clarification when President Duterte said those things that he said.
And Afshin, if we look at it from the United States, here we have President Duterte, who's basically pivoted away from the United States to China. Does that tell us something about the United States and its relationship with the region? Is the U.S. star fading in Asia?
I think it's very interesting because as you know, the U.S. has been talking about this pivot to Asia for quite some time, and some countries have received it warmly, like Japan and South Korea, and others, have not received it as warmly, like China and perhaps, and in this case, Philippines. But Duterte, in many ways, some people are calling him the Donald Trump of Asia. He shoots from the hip. He rips up the playbook. He threatens, long-standing alliances, and I think that's what's happening. But what's also happening is he needs to be careful with his rhetoric, because the Philippines has also been a darling of international emerging markets investors over the past few years, and this kind of rhetoric creates a great deal of uncertainty.
Well, he is getting a lot of investment out of China.
That's right. Yeah. Well, he may. Yeah. Let's see. Let's see. But the big institutional investors have been talking about the Philippines in the same breath as some of the other big emerging markets, and this concerns them.
Raza Rumi, one of the big foreign policy initiatives of the Obama administration has been this pivot to Asia. What happens now when we see what the Philippines is doing? Has President Duterte seriously undermined U.S. foreign policy objectives in that region?
Well, I would not really say that he has seriously undermined, but certainly what he is doing is a clear sort of threat to the U.S. vision of its future role and influence in Asia as Obama presidency ends. And it is, in broader terms, it is also now a clear manifestation of the fact that the world is no longer unipolar, and that in this multipolar and distributed power centers, China has a major role from the region onto the global stage. And while the Philippines president is known for making some very provocative statements, and he's also a populist strongman type figure, but certainly he is playing his cards rather well, because we were earlier talking about the whole anti-establishment mood in so many countries, and so is the case with the Philippines, where the democratic structures have been extremely corrupt and compromised and preserved of a very narrow elite, and who have been historically aligned with the U.S. So there is a domestic angle as well,
right.
But certainly what it shows in many countries, including the Philippines, that it is the rise of China, which is now a reality to be contended with.
Magnus, how does a country like Iceland see the United States? You know, we see these anti-American demonstrations around the world, a lot of people calling the United States a warmonger nation, yet we do have lots of other people who say that, yes, we do need a strong United States. It's essential for international stability, for international order. What kind of sentiment do you hear?
Yeah, I would say in Iceland, I think it's they are looking at the United States as their allies, and also it's very important to have a very good president who is very good in foreign policy and foreign cooperation with other nations, and it's of course very, very important for small nations and bigger nations like Iceland, and so I think. There are many nations, small and big as well, who are looking at the United States now when we have 10 days to the elections, and just wondering what will happen if you have a guy like Trump as a president, but it's, you know, everyone can understand that the United States are the biggest economy in the world, and etc. But it's difficult, you know, how to explain how scared people are with Trump.
Okay, well, the last part of our show right now, and that's the next big story. Let's get it from four of you. Magnus, let me start with you. What's the next big story?
I think the next big story will be policy on innovation. I think politicians and economists as well will have to tackle our rapid development when it comes to technology. We can see self-driving cars hitting the streets, and there's a lot of things going on that can change our economies and our lives. I think this will be a very big case in the next 1 or 2 years, and after a few months we will see politicians talking about this much more.
Yeah, self-driving vehicles, that's going to be a big thing. I saw a report on a self-driving beer truck this weekend. They got their priorities right. Raza Rumi, what's the next big story?
Oh, well, I think there are many stories, but I would say if on the world's politics and the larger sort of global scene, I think Russia, and if after the US election is over, I mean, I think that's the next brewing tension that we have to deal with for some time. Okay,
gentlemen, you guys have 20 seconds each. Wang Guan?
What will China's new foreign policy be? Because we just had a new plenum with the 18th Party Congress that established Xi further as the Chinese leader, as the leader, first among equals. So we'll see how he will steer the Chinese foreign policy forward.
Okay, Afshin.
Middle-class anxieties driving populist candidates from the left and the right in the advanced economies, and increasingly middle-class anxieties in the emerging economies.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.